left her there like she was some old thing no one wanted anymore. No crying, no looking back. Just a woman standing alone by the ruined supply station, a burlap sack tied tightly in her hand, and eyes that had stopped waiting for anything good. That town Prairie Bend was used to turning its back on those who had nothing. But on that scorching day, a man passing by Boone Halley, a widower farmer, a man who had chosen to live quietly rather than say more than was necessary, stopped when he saw her. She didn't say her name. She didn't beg. She just held out the old burlap sack and whispered, "Please, just open it." And when he untied the rope, what fell out wasn't gold or weapons or anything of real-world value. But it was something that made him stand still. What left a man who had buried his wife and children speechless? A tiny woolen shoe, a cracked porcelain milk bottle, and a letter that had never been read until today. That's how the story begins, with a bag containing a forgotten life and a man who didn't turn his back. But what made people stay was not just what fell out of the bag, but what she kept in silence. The unasked-for tenderness, the years that were considered useless, and the promise that had been torn away, rewritten bit by bit with the kindness of two people who were no longer young. Have you ever wondered what happens when a discarded person finds someone who doesn't expect them to be useful? Have you ever wondered if an old bag can carry a lifetime of pain? Can it also hold hope? This is not a story about redemption. This is a story about staying, about being the first one not to leave, about how things that seem dead can bloom again. And if you're listening to this, you're probably the kind of person who believes that. The kindest thing you can do for someone is to sit with them until they believe they're worth staying. Stay tuned until the end, because the most touching is yet to come. That summer came slow, but the heat was silent and heavy, like a curse that hadn't yet decided who to settle on. The wind didn't carry grass or pine, only the dry sting of scorched earth and ash. South of Dry Ridge, at a forgotten supply outpost where wood sagged and nails rusted in place, Catherine Elms was left behind. No ticket, no escort, no farewell. In her hand, a burlap sack worn thin and pulled tight. Nobody asked what was in it, and she never offered. Word had it her husband sent her back like faulty goods in a mail crate. They didn't see the fingers bent from decades of scrubbing floors that weren't hers, or the back that stooped from hauling wood through wind. All they saw was a barren woman with no jewelry and too much silence. Then one day Boone Halley passed through, a rancher, a widower, the kind of man whose name folks only whispered after they ran out of things to gossip about. He'd buried a wife and child in the fever winter of '81. Since then, he rode alone, spoke little, and mended what needed mending without asking who broke it. He hadn't planned to stop, but something about the way she sat back against a warped post gaze, stretched out over the dust like she was searching for something that no longer existed, made him pause. "Someone waiting for you?" he asked. The question wasn't quite gentle, but it wasn't harsh either. Catherine shook her head, then offered the sack. Her voice cracked like cold ashes. "Please, just open it." Boone hesitated. He'd held a spade over graves and a shotgun at wolves, but even his hands trembled as they touched the knot on that sack. It didn't rustle. It didn't resist. But when it opened, he stopped breathing. Inside were not gold coins or a pistol, but three small, quiet things. A pair of tiny wool shoes barely worn, a tin baby bottle chipped at the rim, and an unopened letter with faded ink that read, "If someone loves her, please read this." Boone said nothing, but he did not walk away. That whole afternoon he sat beside her on the cracked step, where the sun carved shadows like broken maps across their feet. No one spoke. No one filled the silence. But there is a kind of quiet that only comes when two people have nothing left to prove and nothing left to lose. And for the first time in what felt like years, Catherine closed her eyes. Not out of exhaustion, but because someone was still there when she opened them. They left her like unwanted freight, but he didn't walk away. And that sack, untouched for years, had just begun to open something deeper. The wind had picked up sometime after dusk. It didn't howl, just pressed against the walls of Boone's cabin, like an old dog pawing to be let in. Inside, the fire cracked softly, warm and golden. Catherine sat near it, knees pulled to her chest, her eyes on the sack now emptied, resting in the corner like a skin shed from something older. She hadn't asked to stay. He hadn't offered. But neither of them moved to part ways that night. Boone brought her a cup of warm milk and half a heel of bread. She ate slowly, as if afraid it might be the last meal made in kindness. He didn't speak, not even to ask her name. Out here, people let names come when they were ready, like trust or rain. The letter sat on the table between them, unopened, heavy in a way that paper shouldn't be. "Did you write it?" Boone asked finally. Catherine looked up startled. "No," she said after a moment. "She did. She, my sister, Liza." Boone said nothing, just let her keep going, though she hadn't meant to speak at all. Something about the fire or the way he didn't stare made her forget she was supposed to stay quiet. She was younger, prettier. People liked her. When I couldn't marry, they said she should go instead. But she didn't want to leave me behind, so she made me a promise. Catherine paused, her voice fragile like thread through a needle. She said, "If we get split up, I'll leave a sign. I'll write you something, so you know I didn't forget." The letter had sat inside that sack for 31 years. "I couldn't open it," she whispered. "I was too afraid." She might have changed her mind. Boone leaned forward, calloused hands resting on the letter's edge. "May I?" Catherine nodded, slow, reluctant, like someone unlocking a door that had stayed shut too long. Boone unsealed the paper. Inside were 4 lines written in a looping, uneven hand. "If someone's holding this, it means you lived. If someone's reading this, it means she loved. And if you stayed kind even after the world turned mean, then you are still my sister, and I am proud." Catherine didn't cry, but she reached for the letter like it was breath. She pressed it to her chest, and for the first time since she had been left at that outpost, she looked Boone in the eyes and said, "Thank you for staying." He didn't answer, just stood, walked to the stove, and poured her another cup of milk. Some kindness didn't need reply. Some stayed quiet, and that was enough. The next morning, Catherine stepped out onto the porch, wrapped in one of Boone's old flannel coats. She watched the sun rise with a stillness that came from surviving too much. Boone saddled up not for town, but to the upper ridge where the fence line had collapsed in winter. As he rode out, she called after him, "If you've got any old thread, I can mend that quilt in the barn." He raised a hand in acknowledgement. Didn't smile, didn't look back, but something in his posture had softened. That afternoon, she found a basket by the door. Inside it, a spool of coarse thread, 2 bent needles, and a tin button carved with a bird in flight. No note, no instructions. But that was Boone's way. He wasn't giving her chores. He was giving her a place. That night, Catherine pulled the quilt over her knees as the fire popped and hissed. She whispered the words from the letter like a quiet song. "Then you are still my sister, and I am proud." And in the quiet, where no one demanded anything of her, she allowed herself a single tear, not for sadness, but for being remembered. After all these years, the letter didn't bring back the past. It brought her back to herself. The days passed slowly on Boone's land, long enough for hurt to loosen its grip, but not yet long enough for the world to forget who she'd been. Catherine moved softly through the cabin, like someone still asking permission to exist. She swept the floors without being asked, restitched the curtains where mice had chewed holes, set an extra tin plate at the table, though no one ever came. And Boone, he let her be. That more than anything was kindness. He didn't speak much. But when she mended a torn saddle strap, he left a small jar of beeswax on the windowsill the next morning. When she boiled potatoes without asking, he chopped firewood without a word and set it near the stove. It wasn't courtship. It wasn't obligation. It was 2 people who had lost too much finding ways to say, "I see you. You're safe here." But kindness has a way of stirring dust in places where people prefer silence. It was Wednesday market day in Prairie Bend. Boone rode into town for feed and salt. Catherine stayed back, watering the garden bed she had coaxed from hard soil, wearing his second-best coat and a scarf tied at the neck. By sundown, whispers had already spread like prairie fire. "She's that woman, ain't she? The barren one from the Miller place." He took her in. "Why, I heard she carries bad luck in that sack of hers." And when Boone returned with burlap bags slung over his mule, he didn't say a thing about the looks he'd caught or the quiet that followed him down Main Street. But Catherine knew. She could smell shame the way a storm smells before it breaks. That evening, she didn't sit by the fire. She went to the barn, climbed into the loft where the hay still smelled like autumn, and curled beside an old quilt she'd mended 2 days before. Boone found her there just before midnight. He didn't scold or offer soft words. Just climbed up, settled into the hay across from her, and rested his elbows on his knees. I ain't much for talk, he said at last. Never have been, but I know this much. He looked at her eyes, weathered but steady. You came here with nothing but what you could carry, and you still chose to be kind. That's more than most ever manage with both hands full. Catherine didn't answer, but she reached into the pocket of the flannel coat and pressed something into his hand. It was the tin button he had given her, now sewn neatly onto a strip of fabric. I thought she said you might want it on your coat. To keep you steady. Boone looked down at the little bird etched into metal. Looks like it's already working, he murmured. But the world outside Boone's land didn't care for quiet transformations. 3 days later, Reverend Malloy came to call. Gray suit, ironed, collar, eyes sharp with judgment, dressed as concern. Brother Hallie, he said, standing on the porch with his Bible and an agenda. The town's been talking. Some folk wondering what kind of example you're setting bringing in a woman like her. Boone didn't flinch. She's mending quilts, feeding chickens, listening to the wind like it speaks her name, he said. If folks got trouble with that, maybe the trouble ain't her. The Reverend frowned. But she's not your kin, not your wife. You got children pass through this land. What do you think they'll see? Boone's voice was flat. They'll see a man who knows the difference between a burden and a blessing. That's what they'll see. The Reverend left without another word, but the tension hung in the air like smoke without flame. That night, Catherine found a fresh sack of seeds left by the kitchen door. Next to it, a note in Boone's handwriting, only 3 words for next season. And though her hands trembled as she folded the note, her voice did not. Because for the first time in years, someone saw her future. Not as a burden, not as a shadow, but as something worth growing. In a town that feared change, they chose each other quietly like roots deepening beneath a frost. The first frost came early that year, arriving before anyone had time to brace their hearts. The cottonwoods yellowed overnight, and wind pressed hard against the roof, like it remembered something it couldn't forgive. But Catherine Elms didn't shiver. She had mended the barn doors. She had planted onions and cut rosemary for drying. She had started humming again, soft under her breath, while scrubbing the stove pot or folding quilts. Boone heard it once and didn't say a word, but he left a jar of molasses on the table the next day, and she understood it as his way of saying, keep going. I hear you. Then one morning a letter arrived. Not Boone's name, not hers, just a seal she hadn't seen in 20 years, the Miller family crest. Boone found her in the garden, the letter unopened in her hand, face unreadable. You know who sent it? He asked. She nodded once. His son, the one I helped raise. Boone didn't ask what it said. He just nodded toward the saddle. You want to ride in? She hesitated. I don't want to go back. You're not, he said. You're just riding through. They rode into Prairie Bend together. Boone quiet as always. Catherine upright scarf pulled neat hair tucked back in a simple braid. At the general store, townsfolk paused, froze. She felt their stares, their whispers trailing behind, like cold smoke. But something in her chest, where silence used to live, remained still. She walked to the counter, held out the letter to Mr. Ansell, the clerk. I won't be needing this anymore, she said. Then, without waiting for response, she turned to leave. On the way out, she paused at the post wall. Dozens of pinned notices fluttered in the wind. Lost horses, drought warnings, wanted men. She tacked something of her own. The old burlap sack tied shut once more. Underneath it, she had written, You left me in silence. But I walked out singing. Boone didn't say a word until they'd ridden halfway home. Did it help? She nodded. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted to stop caring what they gave me. Boone looked at her. You didn't just drop it. You made something else out of it. She smiled faintly. I think you helped. He shrugged. I just brought the horse. That night, she built a fire behind the house. Not for warmth, for release. She pulled out a stack of old linens, some of them from her years at the Miller Ranch. Rags she'd been told to keep because useful women don't waste cloth. She held one to the flame, then another, but paused at the last one, a baby's bonnet never worn, never dirtied, still smelling faintly of cedar. She didn't burn it. She folded it carefully, tied it in a fresh cloth, and placed it in Boone's old trunk at the foot of her bed. Some things she realized we don't burn. We bury them in grace. That same week, Boone carved something new. A wooden sign, rough, unsanded. Elms and Hallie, 4 acres. He nailed it to the post by the front gate. She stood beside him, quiet as wind through tall grass. "You sure?" she asked. "I was sure when I built the fence," he said. "Just took longer to find the right name." They shared supper at the porch table that night. Bread, wild onions, salt pork. No music. Just the hush of two people learning to rest. She asked once, very softly, "Do you think I'm still that woman they left at the station?" Boone didn't look up. He was peeling an apple. "No," he said, calm as always. "I think you're the woman who walked away from it." She didn't fight fire with fire. She met shame with stillness and turned it into song. Winter passed with less bitterness than years before. The frost softened by February. Catherine's rosemary came back unexpectedly, full and green. The chickens started laying again. And Boone found himself smiling quietly to no one in particular each time he passed the stitched quilt she'd hung in the barn like stained glass. They didn't call it home. Not yet. But everything they did had the shape of people who meant to stay. One morning in March, Catherine rose before the sun. The old ache in her knees didn't stop her. She boiled coffee, set out 2 tin mugs, and stepped onto the porch in Boone's coat, her name now stitched inside the collar. He came out minutes later, wiping his hands on a rag. "They're blooming," she said softly. He followed her gaze. At the far fence line, just beyond the creek bed, a scatter of yellow wildflowers had pushed through the earth. They never grew there before, he murmured. She smiled. Sometimes things bloom where they were never wanted. Boone didn't say much for a while. Just sipped his coffee, hands, weathered eyes steady. Then out of nowhere he said, "Would you like your own room?" Catherine blinked. "I'm fine in the loft." He shook his head. "No, I mean a room with a window. Your quilt on the bed. A door that doesn't creak unless you want it to." Her breath caught not from surprise, but because she hadn't known she was waiting for the question. "What would we call it?" she asked. "If not a guest room," Boone looked at her. "I was thinking, yours." They cleared the south corner of the house the next day. She chose pale curtains. He cut the window wide so light could pour in like apology. The door had a brass knob shaped like a heart, an old quiet joke from Boone's father's barn. She didn't ask for it, but he'd saved it anyway. One evening, weeks later, she stood by that window watching dusk fall over the hills. Boone had gone out to check the fence line, the one she used to walk when silence was still armor. She saw him coming back, his silhouette, slow shoulders easy. When he stepped onto the porch, she met him at the door. "I've got something," she said, holding out a small folded square. It was the baby's bonnet, the one she hadn't burned. Inside it, now wrapped with care, was the letter from her sister. "I don't need these to remind me anymore," she said, "but I want them kept, somewhere safe." Boone nodded. "I'll build a box, cedar, lock if you want." She looked at him, really looked. "You already built the place that keeps me safe." That night after supper, she lit a lantern and opened the sack one last time. It held nothing now, no shame, no weight. She walked to the fence where Boone had once nailed the sign Elms and Hallie. Without a word, she tied the empty sack to the post. Let the wind tug at it. Let the past flutter loose. Before heading inside, Boone touched her hand just once, palm to palm, like someone asking permission to stay. And she answered without sound, by staying.